All right, let's spend a little bit of time and talk about the financial planning profession. So, one thing that we see is that the financial planning profession is one of the fastest growing professions in America. If we come right here, we can see that personal financial advisors is growing at a rate of about 30% from 2014 to 2024. So, this is a pretty rapid growth rate. And it ranks among, again, the fastest growing professions of our time. Now, one of the things we like to understand is why our clients are seeking financial advice. And so if we take a look at this gives us a pretty good indication of why a client might come to see us. I think this is most telling right here, right? Clients want help with their long-term goals, and they also just want help with general financial management, right? And so when we see budgeting, really what they're saying is we need help with general financial management. We've got these set of goals. We don't know how to pursue them. So help us allocate our resources to the things that we value so that we can be successful in those things. So one of the things that's happened in the recent past is there's been a little bit of a shift in consumer attitudes towards financial advice. Okay, so in the past, when people came to a financial advisor, they were oftentimes looking for help with products, specifically investment products. And so advisors could recommend a product or sell a product and contribute to the growth of client resources, and that was generally satisfying to clients. Now we're in a situation to where information is readily available, but time is scarce. In addition to that, products have largely been commoditized through advances in technology and more access to information, making things more competitive. And so what people are really looking for is a more comprehensive approach to financial management, right? We've even seen this so much that a lot of financial planners will call themselves life coaches or life planners because they're basically saying, hey, listen, we're not just here to tell you how to manage your resources or your investments. We're really here to help you sleep better at night. We're here to help you enjoy the maximum amount of satisfaction that you can get out of your life by helping you achieve the things that are most valuable to you. And we're going to take this journey with you, and we're going to be there to support you along the way. And so when the affluent choose their advisors, the most important thing that they're looking for, not the only important thing that they're looking for, but the most important thing that they're looking for is trustworthiness, right? Now, trust is a really interesting thing, right? Trust is a substitute oftentimes for expertise. All right. So let's just think about this for a second. If I was going out into the financial marketplace and my degree was in medicine, right? I was a practicing medical professional and I needed help with my finances. Well, I've got two choices, right? Medical professionals are smart people. I can either go out and acquire the domain-specific human capital to manage my own money, or I can go and rent the human capital of someone else. Okay. Now, when I rent the human capital of someone that's already an expert, right? When I go to a financial advisor and I hire that financial advisor to help me with my financial plan, what I'm basically saying is it's more efficient for me to hire you and pay you to help me with this than it is for me to become my own expert and do it myself. Okay, so that makes sense. The trust component comes in the hiring decision when that person either consciously or subconsciously says, I'm going to hire you because you're an expert and I trust, this is the important part, right? I trust that you're going to use your expertise to maximize the benefits to me, the client, not the benefits to yourself, the advisor, right? And so trustworthiness, again, is kind of a substitute to knowledge. And so it's super important, the CFP board's framework that starts with the fiduciary standard. We talked about this in a previous lecture, right? The CFP board says if you're going to hold the certification, then the very first order of business is you have to put the client's interest ahead of your own, and you have to act in that best interest. In other words, you have to be trustworthy, right? You have to be trustworthy when people rent your expertise. Now, kind of other reasons that people choose not to participate in financial advice. It's hard to know what sources can be trusted. And so anytime we say, hey, listen, I recognize that I'm going to have to place some trust to make this decision. On the flip side of that coin, we're also recognizing that it's possible that the person that we're going to be working with is not trustworthy. And so going back to our acquire the expertise or rent the expertise example, if I choose not to acquire the expertise, what I'm basically choosing is to say, I'm not going to be perfectly knowledgeable on being able to determine who is and who isn't a trustworthy expert. And so it creates doubt. And if people can't identify who's trustworthy because they can't basically distinguish between high quality providers and low quality providers, then it sometimes makes them hesitant to enter the marketplace. And so one way that we can overcome that is with a signal, right? And a certification or license is a good example of a signal. And what the CFP certification says is basically this is a signal of trust. I am trustworthy as an expert based on the requirements that it took to obtain my CFP certification. You can trust that I'm knowledgeable, and I'm trustworthy by the regulation that's been placed on me, as I must act as a fiduciary by putting your interest ahead of my own and acting in your best interest. So the CFP says, hey, listen, I've got a high quality signal of trustworthiness that should reduce your hesitation to enter the market and hire me for my services and increase your trust that I'll be able to serve you well. Now, there are other marks that are lower quality signals than the CFP. In fact, a lot of designations are much easier to obtain than the CFP certification, and there's a mountain of them in the marketplace. Well, the hard thing about other designations is that oftentimes the consumer doesn't know the difference between the letters behind a person's name. And so you could have someone with CFP behind their name and the next person have DPA behind their name. And you're like, which one's better? They both have three letters. And so they might be equivalent in their expertise if you don't know the difference between a CFP and a DAP, which, by the way, I just made up. What's even more confusing is when people go into the marketplace and start getting a lot of designations and have 4, 5, 6 sets of letters behind their name, right? And so now people are sending a signal to the market that they're trustworthy, but the cost of the letters behind their name in terms of time, energy, capital, intelligence were much lower than the cost for a higher quality signal like the CFP. And so some consumer education on the difference between different marks is very, very valuable. If we were in the accounting world, there's no questions asked that the CPA is the gold standard of accounting, right? Whether it be for tax preparation or for auditing. But for public accounting, CPA is the gold standard. There's no question about it. Consumers readily recognize it. We're not quite there with the CFP to where people just say, I'm only working with the CFP because I know that's the best option for me when it comes to financial advice. But we're getting closer and closer with each passing year. Awareness is going up. Demand for CFPs is steadily on the rise. And that's a really positive thing for our profession. So some examples of some other certifications that are high quality: the Chartered Financial Consultant, the Personal Financial Specialist. These are very CFP-like marks that signal high quality to the marketplace. So what is required to become a CFP? Well, we call it the 4 E's. You have education, exam, experience, and ethics. All right. So that's the entry-level requirements to becoming a CFP, right? The 4 E's. And then the 5th E, continuing education, is what's required to maintain that certification. So for an education, you have to have a degree. The degree does not have to be in financial planning, but you do have to have a degree, and you have to have some college level credit associated with the requirements set forth by the CFP board. Now that can be in a degree program, that can be as a minor, that can be as a concentration as part of a degree program, that can even be part of a certificate program once someone has finished a degree. But you have to have a degree, and as part of your education, you have to meet the education requirements set forth by the CFP board. Once you get your educational component taken care of, you're qualified to sit for the exam. At this point in time, you're what's called a CFP candidate. And you can actually put this on your resume. And what it signals is that I've completed the education, but I haven't completed the exam, right? And so the exam is a 6-hour computer-based exam, 3-hour session in the morning with a lunch break, followed by a 3-hour session in the afternoon. So 6 hours total. It consists of, man, I think it's 170 questions. Don't quote me on that, but it's somewhere in that ballpark. And it covers 72 principal knowledge topics set forth by the CFP board. And so when you think about the CFP exam, this is a test of competence. Now, that competence doesn't require complete and total expertise in all 72 principal knowledge topics, but it does require proficient understanding of all topic areas. And so a lot of the times I'll describe this as 6 inches deep and a mile wide, right? More than an inch deep, but it's definitely a broader range of topics than it is a depth per topic when preparing for that exam. A lot of times people say, well, what do I need to do to prepare for this exam to be successful when I take it? My advice is to get a good review program. I'll just plug who we partner with at Texas Tech, which is Dalton Review. With your review program, you probably need to spend between 200 and 250 hours after graduation in studying for the exam. It is a function of time. And if you invest the right amount of time, it's pretty much a guarantee that you're going to pass. As soon as you start deviating from that time, then your probability of passing goes way down. So just for what that's worth, I hope it's helpful. Once you pass the exam, before you can hold the CFP mark, you have to meet the experience requirement. Okay, now this says 2 or 3 years. In reality, it's 4,000 or 6,000 hours. 4,000 hours if you're in an apprenticeship. And when we say apprenticeship, basically your direct supervisor is a CFP. And so if you're working directly for a CFP, then you need 4,000 hours of experience. If you're not working directly with a CFP, then you need 6,000 hours of experience. A full-time year is about 2,000 hours. And so that's why 2 or 3 years is commonly used as the experience requirement. And then you have to take an oath to abide by the code of ethics. All right, well, once you do all that, then you can put CFP behind your name. And to keep CFP behind your name, you have to complete 30 hours of continuing education every 2 years, with 2 of those hours being in ethics. Now, is it worth it? It sounds like a lot of work. Well, I think that this article is a pretty good indication that it is. And this article is even a little bit old, but we can see here, right, that people with a CFP earn very similar to people with a CPA, right? And so we're seeing average annual earnings of about $140,000 in this field, right? Now, if we compare that to no designation or 1 designation or 2 designations, right? Usually the 1 designation is the most, and that seems a little bit counterintuitive, but based on what we talked about just a little bit earlier on the alphabet soup slide, is the people that are investing in 1 certification are usually investing in the best certification in their field. And so they don't see the need to get additional certifications. People with multiple, not always, but a lot of times are investing in lower quality marks and do not have as high a level of expertise, even though they have more letters behind their name. Again, not always true, but on the average probably is. So that's encouraging. Is it worth it to get your CFP? Yeah, it's probably worth about 30 grand a year. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that short presentation on an introduction to the profession. Up next, we'll talk a little bit about compensation models to wrap up Unit 2.